I have here a number of alterated articles. Here is a bottle of cherries, originally picked green, in order that they might be firm, with the green color all taken out with acid until they were perfectly white, and then colored with a lean dye, which is poisonous in any quantity.
Not everything you see on an advertisement is true. You don't lose weight instantly, you don't get ripped by just eating a product, and we all know that. But imagine instead of just advertisements being false, but also the ingredients in your food as well. During the Gilded Age, food as well as business was unregulated, which caused lack of care for public health by the food industry. The Poison Squad of 1901 was a group made up of young men that had volunteered to test additives to determine if they were safe to eat. Dr. Harvey Wiley, the founder of the Poison Squad, would perform these experiments to help better food conditions in the United States during the early 20th century. Publication of the Poison Squad's experiments led citizens to question the food they were eating.
Since the 1700s, most of the food in the United States were from local farms, usually right from the crop to the shop to the pot and finally the plate. However, the introduction of larger cities and a large-scale increase in population brought by the Gilded Age had threatened the food shortage. The recent paradigms of factories, however, introduced the solution through processed food, which was easy to mass produce and quick to prepare and then eat. Not only did factories suppress the threat of food shortage, but it had also put businesses directly in control of the food supply. Factories and urbanization had also presented another issue. The new factories created by monopolies and land grants would force farms to move farther away from civilization, resulting in another issue: spoiled food. The long treks from farms to factories had caused food to arrive spoiled, distasteful, and inedible. To combat this, businesses used another Gilded Age invention: preservatives. Preservatives helped food spoil slower, but some of the chemicals used to preserve food were still experimental. Since businesses were not regulated by the government due to the laissez-faire capitalism, food suppliers could get away with using any preservative or additive, despite its potential toxicity to consumers. Some chemicals such as borax and formaldehyde were used heavily by processing plants as preservatives. In fact, these two solutions were so effective as preservatives, they are the two most used chemicals in taxidermy. The worst part about these chemicals is that there was no previous research done to measure the toxicity of these chemicals. This allowed any business to export almost anything and label it as food, without any chance of them being shut down by a court case.
Not a lot of people knew about the dark side of the food industry, but the people who did know became progressives. One of those progressives was Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley. Dr. Harvey Wiley was born in 1844 on a frontier farm in Indiana. He attended Indiana Medical College, where he would receive a medical degree. After graduating again, this time from Harvard, Wiley would be hired as a chemistry professor at the newly founded Purdue University. After being fired due to misconduct, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he became the chief chemist in the Department of Agriculture. He immediately noticed the majority of strange chemicals in food. He would find borax, lead, copper sulfate, and tons more of industrial solvents and solutions, and with his chemical knowledge, he knew there had to be at least some negative side effects. He would argue in front of the Supreme Court for regulations, but would come out empty-handed. It turns out that the lack of research into any of the chemicals couldn't prove any of the chemicals were indeed poisonous. This lack of evidence, however, gave him a great idea. If there was no research done to test how poisonous the substances were, then he would have to do the research himself. He started by forming a group of 12 healthy students from colleges and high schools. During breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the group would eat before they all take capsules with the chemical they were testing. This method was used to prevent Poison Squad members from avoiding the poisonous food. The rest of the rules within the group were even more strict. You weren't allowed to eat anywhere else. You had to check everything from hair, weight, temperature, pulse, and excrement. Also, the only way you can take a break from the food was if you were deemed too sick to continue. One of the main benefits besides free food was the ability to sue the government for any and all ailments that were caused by the experiment, as all the chemicals used were not considered poisonous.
The experiments were originally called the Hygienic Table Trials, but George Rothwell Brown from the Washington Post had come up with a better title, the Poison Squad. Their first discovery of how borax increases the toxicity of other chemicals had started their first large media influence. And the actual articles made about the Poison Squad's discoveries were certainly taking hold of the public. In fact, it had started to create outrage against the food industry. Eventually, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture began to classify a large amount of the poison squad's discoveries to prevent riots or civil unrest. Wiley would later use the press in the fight for food regulation. People in the United States finally woke up against the new epidemic of poisonous food. Alongside Harvey Wiley, Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, also helped push the public to a new reform for better food and had even caused a mass boycott against meat-packing plants. Despite the number of congressmen who were against Wiley's work, he had still made his impact. The Poison Squad was on the front page of the newspapers. Poison Squad members became famous, and they were praised by poems and songs such as
On prussic acid we break our fast, we lunch on morphine stew. We die with matchhead consomme, drink carbolic acid brew. Corruptive supplement tones us up like laudanum ketchup rare, while trial toxicon condiments are as wholesome as mountain air. Thus all deadlies we double dare to put us beneath the sod. We death immunities and we're proud as proud, hooray for the prison squad.
And how would I describe the Poison Squad's reception from the press? It was embraced in a kind of, this is fascinating, this is entertainment, this is super weird science way at first. I mean, almost like novelty science. You saw a lot of stories in the Washington Post that were, here's all these weird things that these crazy scientists at USDA are doing. But gradually, especially as the results came out, you see a shift in which people, and that included reporters, start realizing that they themselves are eating these risky compounds all the time, that it's part of their everyday life. So you see a kind of shift in public interest from first kind of being intrigued to at the last really being outraged.
Due to the work of Dr. Harvey Wiley and the Poison Squad, new food restrictions on products were created to protect all consumers and show the harmful effects of food preservatives and unsafe additives. The Poison Squad's legacy was directly involved in the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, otherwise known as the FDA. The Poison Squad left a varying amount of impacts on the food industry. A small impact that the Poison Squad had was on food preservatives. Any preservative during the 1990s that were certified as toxic were now banned from food. Today we no longer use those harmful chemicals in our foods, and we found different methods of preserving our foods like canning, pickling, irradiation, pasteurization, smoking, drying, freeze-drying, and safer chemical additives. While most chemicals such as borax have been banned as an additive in the US, some chemicals including formaldehyde and benzoate have not been banned but have still been restricted. A long-term impact that the Poison Squad had were labels on food products. Labels became a basic requirement before food was exported. It wasn't until 84 years later, during 1990, that President George H.W. Bush signed the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act on November 8th of 1990. The Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, or NLEA, required food manufacturers to place labels on most food products.
Amends the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to deem a food misbrand unless its label bears nutrition information that provides 1. The serving size, 2. The number of servings, 3. The number of calories per servings, 4. The amount of total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbonates, complex carbonates, sugars, total proteins, and dietary fibers per servings, and 5. Subjects to conditions, vitamins, minerals, or other nutritions.
Recently, on November 22, 2019, the FDA had employed a recall on all romaine lettuce because of a large-scale E. coli contamination. The FDA would investigate the source and personally take lettuce off of shelves to prevent further contamination. Without the work and efforts of the Poison Squad, we would still be eating food full of borax, copper sulfate, and other harmful chemical additives, as well as potential additives that could impact our health as a whole.